Welcome to Cloud on Air, live webinars from Google Cloud. We're hosting webinars daily. My name is Stephen Elliott. I'm a product manager on Cloud Billing. And today we're going to be answering questions about Google Cloud Platform Resource Organization and Access Management. And I have with me today a great friend of my team.
Max Sack. Nice to meet you.
Yep, he's a support lead for Cloud Billing. You can ask us questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. So let's get started. The agenda for today is to talk about resource organization and access management, which we're going to refer to as resource management because the other is a mouthful. And then we'll talk about resources and roles best practices for each of the different entities and structures we talk about in the presentation. And then finally, some examples in the wild of how people configure their accounts and their organizations and some common questions that we get asked.
A few things we want you to walk away today with is first a good high-level understanding of the resources that are involved when we talk about resource management and how they relate to one another. Second, we want to be able to give you some best practices that you can apply when you're making those decisions for configuring those resources. And then lastly, because we only have about 40 minutes today and there's a lot of detail to get through, we want to make sure that we leave you with a guide that will help you a little bit more step-by-step actually set up your account and all of the details that are involved in doing that. All right, so let's get started with a brief overview of resource management. What is this? Big question. Basically, it's concerned with answering the question, how should I configure and grant access to the various cloud resources for my company or my team? And this really requires that you think through how you want your team and the various functions, the various members of your team to interact with GCP, which requires that you understand the different resources that there are to interact with. And then to very intentionally set up those resources to actually align with the plan that you have for your company. Even though there's a lot of sort of unique decisions that need to be made to suit your team or your company, there's also some really clear best practices that we want to make sure that you keep in mind when you're configuring these resources so that you're set up for success from the start.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much just thinking about some of these in advance goes a long way. It really impacts your team's ability to understand costs, to get access to the right resources in your organization. And so just being aware of what's available to you before you really start to scale really helps your organization out, also helps Max's team out.
Absolutely. From a support standpoint, as I mentioned, I'm on the billing support team. We see a lot of these cases. In fact, close to a third of our billing support case volume is related to misconfigured resources. So, by following these best practices and these steps, we really want to help you out to avoid having to encounter those. So, what are the resources that we're actually talking about when we speak about resource management? We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail later in the slides. But to start, I want to sort of tee this up for you guys. So domain and organization, we'll discuss the difference between these, but for now know that they're basically linked on a one-to-one basis. And together they create this sort of umbrella that allows you to nest all of your other GCP resources beneath it to help you streamline the organization and the administration of those resources. You have a billing account, which basically tracks all of your usage within GCP and is responsible for paying the bill basically for GCP in concert with your payment profile. The payment profile it's not a GCP, it's not a cloud-specific resource, it's actually a Google resource, and it contains all of your payment information like debit cards, credit cards, etc. And then lastly, we have projects, folders, and labels, which collectively create this really flexible mechanism that allows you to organize not only your costs and cost management, but also access to your resources. All right, so zooming out a bit, this resource hierarchy gives us a good sort of visual understanding of how these things relate to one another. You see in the red boxes at the top, domain and organization create this sort of umbrella structure, and you see all of the other GCP resources that are nested underneath that. In the blue box, kind of in the middle of the screen, you see the projects. The projects are kind of like your basic container where you consume GCP resources. The billing account, you see a sort of a dotted line in between the billing account going into the projects. The billing account pays for those projects. And then you have folders and you have labels, which together allow you to organize your projects and also apply labeling to help with cost management practices. And then lastly, you see in that yellow box over to the left, that lonely box outside of GCP, that is your payment profile, and that connects into GCP via your billing account. And it contains your payment information, credit cards, et cetera.
And as we go through this, we'll talk through how to set up permissions on each of these different resources and entities so that you can have kind of a coherent way of managing all of them that doesn't break down as you scale.
That's a great point. So each of these resources has their own permissions, has their own roles that are managed completely separately. So you can start to understand, if you set these up in a haphazard way, you're not thinking through sort of the big picture plan, it's really easy to get yourself into a state where they're not really working together, and it creates those issues that folks end up emailing into support about.
So to get started with that, one thing that you probably already know GCP supports is identity and access management. But for a quick primer, identity and access management helps you control access to GCP resources, including the organization's billing accounts and other entities that Max talked about on the previous slide. And then with those permissions, you can enforce granular access controls, in particular by either using default roles or custom roles on users. So you kind of manage them by role and then figure out which users need which roles to do their job. So in the table here, we have examples of roles where you can enforce granular access controls by figuring out which users need which roles. So for example, in a billing account, you can have an administrator. On the organization, you can have an administrator as well. But maybe you want to give some user just specific access to be an administrator on the instance, or to just be a project user or project viewer. And the nice thing is once you have that, you can also have a built-in audit trail of who accessed what and when. Now, two principles to keep in mind when you're setting these identity and access management permissions and roles are the principles of least privilege, which you may have heard of, and the principle of what Max and I like to call reasonable redundancy. So in this diagram, to illustrate this, you want to make sure that the right users have the access to the right resources. So here, yellow users get to access yellow storage, green users get to access green APIs, red users get to access red VMs. And there's a gray user. There's no gray resources, so that person doesn't get to access anything. Now, in the case of green, there's not reasonable redundancy. If the green user meets a horrible fate, goes on PTO, paid time off, then no one else is able to access those APIs. And so it's useful to think about who the set of users is that should be able to access a resource, just because any particular person may not always be around, and you get kind of a single point of failure.
We see problems with the lack of reasonable redundancy all the time, so it's something we'll probably be repeating quite a bit. All right, so now hopefully you have a good understanding of what we mean by resource management and the resources that are involved. Now we're going to go through each one sort of step by step and provide some configuration guidance and best practices as you think about setting those up, as well as the most common roles that are going to be necessary to do that. So starting with domains and organizations. Again, the domain and organization create this umbrella that helps you administer and streamline how you're controlling your resources going forward. And it's really powerful for a couple reasons. Let's break these out now, domains and organizations. A domain is really, in the same way that a web domain is kind of like the name for your website, the domain in the context of cloud is like the name for your cloud organization. And it's at this level that really defines who is in your organization. What does a membership look like? And you're also able to administer different policies, organization-level policies, such as enabling two-factor authentication, or if you have Chromebooks that your company happens to use, if you want to universally change the wallpaper on a Chromebook, you can do that. Or if you need to recover, one of your users gets locked out of their account and you need to reset the password. It's at this level that you're able to actually perform those functions. And where you do that is at the Google Admin Console, which you can view at admin.google.com. On the other side, on the organization side, which you can think about as being more specific to GCP, you have basically maps on a one-to-one basis to your domain. So when you create a domain, it will automatically create an organization. And the organization you can think of as kind of like that root node within your GCP resource hierarchy, which you saw on the previous slide, sort of at that top, everything else sort of flows underneath it. Because this is specific to GCP, this resource, the organization, provides you the visibility and the control to move and manage access to all of those other GCP resources. This is important for a couple reasons. In proactive management, say your company merges with another one, or you make an acquisition, and now you need to change the architecture of your GCP landscape, having an organization and an organization administrator will help make that process much, much easier than trying to coordinate all the individuals that individually own those resources. Also, it's helpful for reactive management. We see this a lot on the support side. A person, a user, a team member of a company leaves the company sporadically for some reason, and they were the only administrator on a project or a billing account, and now the company has no access to that resource. If that resource happened to be in an organization, they would be safe because the organization could basically take control of that resource. But if it's not, then you're kind of out of luck. So this is really important to keep in mind. And then lastly, all of your organization-related stuff, anything related to GCP resources, is managed from the GCP console. All right, so a couple of key configuration decisions or actions that you're going to need to make on the domain side first. So to set up a domain, you have a couple of options. You can either use Cloud Identity or you can use G Suite. We won't go into the details between these two, but basically G Suite, most of you probably already know, comes with a suite of productivity tools. It's a paid product. Cloud Identity is a mostly free product. And so you can decide which one makes the most sense for your company. But whichever you choose, creating a domain is going to be really important. Once you've set up your domain, the next step will be to actually import in or set up all of the users in your domain. And you can do that one by one at the Google Admin Console, or you can do it en masse using a tool like the Cloud Directory Sync. On the other side, you have the organization. And as I mentioned, organizations are automatically created when you set up your domain. So once you have your domain, the next step will be, assuming that you've already been using GCP, you'll need to migrate all of your resources, your projects, your billing account, into your new organization so that it can have that sort of protection. It's almost like an insurance policy in case you lose access to any of those resources. And then lastly, now that you have your resources in your org, you have your users set up in your domain, your org, now you can start granting specific roles, specific permissions to those folks across the various resources that are in the org.
Now, you mentioned there's kind of two ways to set up a domain, either identity or some people who come in through G Suite and then start using Google Cloud Platform. Can you talk a little bit about if there are any issues or how easy it is to start from one, let's say start from G Suite and then create an identity domain, or start with identity and then go to G Suite?
Definitely, yeah. So you can use both of them side by side. And in fact, that makes a lot of sense. If you have G Suite's a paid product, so if you're paying for seats for folks that are in your company, that makes sense. But say you hire a contractor that you want to do some development work and provide access to various resources in GCP, you're also able to use Cloud Identity alongside that. So there is some flexibility there. Cool.
So let's talk about some best practices. Max mentioned some of these. So the first one is to use organizations and keep it to only one organization if possible. This will be a recurring theme, but where you can, keep it simple. Keep it to one organization. And then organizations give you extra tools that you can use, which we'll talk about later, that help you do further resource and access management. So another one that's interesting is especially if you're coming from a G Suite organization, is to make sure you control who is actually allowed to create billing accounts in your organization. We recommend removing the billing account creator role from your organization,
yes,
kind of outright, and limiting it to a few people with reasonable redundancy. And then another best practice is to use the organization setup wizard to help migrate large amounts of resources. So Max mentioned being able to migrate projects. If there's an acquisition or if there's a reorganization of how you're doing things, you can use the organization setup wizard to do that. And then finally, when you have an organization that allows you to organize resources and projects into folders and take advantage of the resource hierarchy to manage sets of permissions, hierarchical policies, and so use those org and folder level permissions to standardize how you manage roles and resources across your organization.
Cool. All right, so we talked about the resources, the resource domain and organization, and we talked about some of the configuration best practices there. Now let's talk about the roles that are necessary to do this. So on the domain side, there's this thing called a domain super admin, and this is basically the person that will have the ability to do all the stuff that we just talked about. When you create your domain, by default, that person that created the domain will be the first domain super admin. They have the ability to administer that directory of members, upload the members, manage the members. They can grant admin roles, which is, again, that sort of GCP specific thing, and they themselves are the first org admin. And they also have the ability, very important ability, to recover accounts at the domain level. So if a person gets locked out of their account, they forget their password, the domain super admin can reset password.
This happens a surprising number of times.
It really does, and not just in small companies,
right.
Really large companies as well. Yeah. On the organization side, you have something called an org admin. And again, think about more as a GCP function. This person has the ability to administer all of your GCP resources. They can recover that lost access if someone leaves the company sporadically, and then you need to recover access to a billing account, for example, or a project. This person can do that. And this person is also kind of like that quarterback that can oversee the migration of resources into your organization, or re-architecture if that's necessary. And already mentioned there, by default, the super admin will be the first org admin when you set up the account.
Great. So one thing that is a good way to frame the best practices here is to think about the jobs to be done. As a product manager, we actually talk about this a lot. It's kind of a framing mechanism to figure out what is the job to be done of the user for a feature we're developing. It's actually a perfect analogy for these role assignments. So what are the literal jobs to be done that your users need to do? And think of it as a set. So don't think of just Max needs to be my org admin. Think of it as people like Max. What's that set of admins? And create a role for that. And make sure that it's more than one person. At this point, it feels like we're beating a dead horse, but I can assure you that the horse is not yet dead. So the second point is that you need to remember that these key roles can help recover lost access. Max might meet a horrific fate. He might go on extended PTO for 5 days, and we have no way to access the org, which is why it's really important to have backup and reasonable redundancy. And then finally, it's not good enough to have reasonable redundancy if no one knows who all the organization admins are. Kind of a key point here is that we protect private information. So when you don't have access to a resource, it may often mean that you can't even see that it exists. Yep. You don't know who manages it, and that's by design. So a lot of organizations have good practices around internal wikis and other communication methods to make sure people understand who is in charge, who can recover lost access, and other issues like that.
All right. Next up, we have billing accounts. As we mentioned, billing account is basically the resource that pays for all of your usage within GCP. It contains all of the costs that you use as you're consuming those GCP resources. Important to point out here that when you're using GCP and you have a billing account, all of the usage that resides in that billing account results in a single invoice. So you have a single invoice per billing account that you happen to be using. The billing account defines the way that you pay for your invoice, again, in concert with the payment profile, which we'll talk about next. And it has its own roles and permissions, like all of the other resources that we're going to talk about. And it operates in a single currency.
One key point there is that this kind of comes up in many questions. Just remember, the billing account is the ultimate container that generates the invoice. That is what you owe Google.
Definitely. So when you're configuring a billing account, a couple things that you're going to need to do is first decide if you need one or multiple billing accounts. And this is a really big point. We want to strongly encourage you to use a single billing account if at all possible. And I think Stephen will talk about a couple situations where it might make sense to have multiple, but the overhead and managing the complexity that gets introduced if you have multiple, it can go wrong in a lot of different ways, and we see that on the support side. And so if it's at all possible, we really want to encourage you to restrict it to a single billing account. Once you create your billing account, you'll need to create or identify who the administrator will be on that billing account. If you're only using one, that should be easy because that will be your primary billing account. And then assuming you're already using GCP, you'll need to migrate all of your existing resources, your projects, in the same way that we kind of did for the organization, over to this primary billing account. And then lastly, if you're using multiple billing accounts after you've migrated over to that primary billing account, we want to encourage you to settle any final balances that you have on those older billing accounts and close them completely, because they can continue to trip you up. Even if you have some random project with a little bit of usage, it can create a lot of complexity down the line. So we want to sort of handle that.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good segue to a second horse that we're in the process of beating, which is to have a single billing account if you can. Closing them is really important. This is the same thing with credit cards. There's unexpected charges that show up on billing accounts you stopped tracking. That can become a major problem. So really try to limit it to one. On the billing account, there's a couple things you really should do as well, which is enable BigQuery detailed billing export to BigQuery. That's something we covered in the first webinar in this series, and I'll cover in more depth in another webinar. But that is data that you can't retroactively fill. And so the moment you open a billing account, set up detailed billing export to BigQuery on it. And then finally, consider setting up budget alerts on the billing account as well. So you don't always have to proactively check reports and export, although you should make it a habit. You can also set up some intelligent alert thresholds that just give you a notification when your spending passes a certain level.
All right. So roles for billing accounts. The billing account administrator is going to be that main role that basically can do all the things that we just talked about. They can manage the payment instruments. They can enable billing export, as Stephen just mentioned as a best practice. They can view costs and budget alerts, link and unlink projects, manage the other user roles that we're about to talk about. But really importantly, from a support standpoint, anybody that reaches out to billing support inquiring about account-specific information, we require that person to be a billing account administrator. And this is for privacy reasons. So we don't want to disclose any information about your billing account to folks that really shouldn't have access to that information. So in the same way that we talked about previously, best practice of ensuring everyone in your organization knows who the org admins are, you should do the same thing for the billing account admin. Billing account user, much more limited in scope. Basically, this person has the ability to view costs and also link projects into the billing account. So this is often granted in concert with the project creator role. So you're basically giving a person the ability to create a project and then fund that project by creating it, linking it back to the billing account. And then lastly, you have a billing account viewer role, which basically can just view the costs but not really change anything in the billing account.
Right. And that's great for things like you might need a financial analyst or business analyst just to help you look at costs. You don't need to give them any extra permissions. They're just a viewer.
Exactly.
So some best practices there are to set up more than one billing admin. Again, this is a thing we come back to over and over again. And then to grant access to those who might need them, like I just mentioned. It could be a business analyst, a financial analyst, someone else in your org who's who owns cost for that project, and give them access to billing reports by giving them the billing account viewer role. There's also a way to do a more restricted version of this viewing permissions we'll talk about later, just on the project. But when you have a billing account viewer permission, you can see all the costs that roll up to the billing account.
All right, next up we have payment profile. And like we said, the payment profile is a Google level resource. So it sits outside of that umbrella of GCP resources, importantly, because the organization, the GCP organization, doesn't have the ability to manage the payment profile. You can view your payment profile actually if you go to payments.google.com. This might be a good exercise to sort of build some conceptual understanding of what the payment profile does and how it relates to your products at Google. So like we said, the payment profile is responsible for actually paying for all of the Google services that require payment. It's not just GCP. So actually, if I pop back here real quick, you can see the payment profile connects to the billing account via an arrow, but you can also imagine a bunch of other lines that are coming out of the payment profile and going into other boxes that are specific to other Google products like AdWords, YouTube, Google Play, etc. The payment profile stores your payment information, credit cards, debit cards, bank accounts. And it's at this level, the payment profile level, that controls who can actually view or receive invoices. And again, the payment profile is managed completely separately in terms of roles and permissions. So some key actions here. Payment profile is a little complex, and so there's some key things to keep in mind when you're configuring this. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you think about setting up your payment profile is decide if you need one or multiple. Again, same situation as the billing accounts. Strongly encourage you to have a single one. Having multiple can create a lot of additional complexity that you want to avoid. I think Stephen will mention some of the reasons where it might make sense to have multiple in a bit. In either case, though, we want to strongly encourage you to use a business payment profile, assuming that your organization, your company, is separate for taxable purposes, separate entity. The reason for this is a business payment profile allows you to provide or grant access, other access, notifications, alerts to that payment profile, versus if you use an individual payment profile, only you yourself would be able to access it. So it's an important distinction there. So assuming that you set that up, you'll need to identify who you want that payment profile administrator to be to manage the profile. Really important to note here, there's no place that you go to actually create your payment profile. This happens automatically in the context of GCP when you create your billing account. So when you create your billing account, you're presented with a couple of options. Do you want to create a new payment profile to associate that billing account with, or do you want to connect it to an existing payment profile? So assuming your company already has an existing payment profile, you're using other Google services, paid Google services, it will be really important to ensure that the administrator or one of the administrators on that payment profile is the person that sets up your GCP billing account, because it will present them with the option to connect the two. So assuming that you've done that, you'll then need to add users, and you can set email preferences for account alerts, notifications, that sort of thing on the payment profile. And again, that's only possible if you're using a business payment profile. We also recommend that you add an additional form of payment, a backup form of payment. Oftentimes, a credit card will lapse, it'll expire, and it's always good practice to have a backup there so that you don't have any sort of gaps in payment and it doesn't affect your service in any way. And for those folks that are using invoice billing, we recommend that you assign multiple recipients, email addresses, physical addresses for paper invoices to receive those. And one thing I want to mention actually just bears repeating is that the payment profile affects all of those Google services that are connected to it, not just GCP. So keep that in mind when you're granting access or making changes to the payment profile, because it could be affecting other Google services that maybe you're unaware of, or maybe your department doesn't really involve or work with.
If possible, you should limit your company to one payment profile. Again, payment profiles are actually by business entity if you're a business, and so if there's an address, Google will look that up and tie that back to the entity. And you should regularly review the information in the profile. Who's the contact information? Where's the CSV, the invoice PDF and CSV being sent? So kind of to Max's point about payment profiles affecting other businesses, it's possible your company set up business with Google before, and someone on the ads team is actually the payment profile administrator, and we've definitely had fairly large companies wonder where their GCP invoices went because they never put themselves on the payments profile. So that's something to review regularly, monthly, quarterly, periodicity that makes sense for you based on employee turnover and things like that.
Yep. All right, so the core role here is going to be the payment profile administrator. Probably noticing a theme here with our naming of roles. This person has the ability to do all the things we just talked about. View and manage payment methods, make payments, view the invoices, and then see payment accounts. Payment accounts in this case are the other Google services that are nested under that payment profile. So GCP would be a payment account, AdWords would be a payment account, et cetera.
Yep. And best practices again, set up more than one payment profile administrator, make sure you have reasonable redundancy there, and ensure appropriate user receiving the documents, like I mentioned before. You shouldn't have a situation which we have had where the director of infrastructure told me his job is to take the invoice CSV from the payments profile in GCP console to accounts payable. And he would love for that not to be his job and not to be working out of office space. So make sure the right people get the information they need so they have good processes within your organization. And to that point, consider making billing account admins on GCP your payment admins as well. There's cases where it makes sense to keep them separate. Some people shouldn't be in Google Cloud Platform even though they should be receiving the invoice. But a lot of cost administrators on Google Cloud Platform in your organization should see the invoice of that cost. So finally, let's talk about projects, folders, and labels, so everything within the organization. Here you can see that within the organization, you can organize things by folder, multiple levels of folders, and then projects. So what are projects? Projects, kind of think of them as the fundamental container for resources and costs on Google Cloud Platform. Almost everything you use runs within a project with some exceptions. Just so you know what those exceptions are, they'll look like support costs, some other kind of billing account-wide costs that aren't specific to any project. But almost every resource you use will be within a project. Folders become very useful once you are an organization user. Yep. That allows you to set up folders, and you can have folders up to 4 deep to organize your projects. So for example, if you have a folder for a cost center, then anytime you add that cost center, that department adds a project, it's just automatically rolled up to the folder, and the permissions can be managed the same way. And then labels are great for tracking usage within a project. Not all usage within a project might be accounted for the same way cost-wise, and also tracking usage across projects that are similar in type.
Worth noting here probably too is this is really the right level of resource to use for cost management purposes. I think folks end up using multiple billing accounts or payment profiles as kind of a proxy or a hack to do cost management, but we should really view these things as doing the heavy lifting for our cost management.
Right. Yeah, and I'll show you some examples of how that looks in the wild. So some key decisions here. One is decide a strategy for how you want to organize your resources using these tools, and determine naming conventions. So naming conventions, always boring to talk about, but always fun to hear the issues on. So it's a large company, and the cost administrator, the infrastructure cost director, was chasing down a project that was really expensive and couldn't figure out what it was just because it wasn't named well, it wasn't in a folder. He finally found out it was the nickname of the CTO, and the CTO named his projects by his own nickname. And so the really expensive cost was in fact authorized, he just didn't know it. So naming conventions help. Folders would also help. So if the CTO was only allowed to create things in the R&D folder for that kind of purpose, it would just have automatically rolled up. So some examples of how you might organize your resources. Folders to represent cost centers, maybe folders to represent teams or applications. But let's say you go with cost center, then projects could represent things like the environment, not the weather, but things like staging, development, production, or folders on projects under that folder might be teams. So cost center 1, but team ABC. So just think about what makes the best sense for how you manage your costs and your operations. And then labels could indicate applications within an environment, or it could indicate things that are common across all of your environments, like security cost or a maintenance cost. So some key actions. Make sure that you create and edit the IAM policies that you can on the folder level if you're using them. That way you have kind of standard permissions at the folder level. For example, you might have a set of permissions for a folder that's really a sandbox folder, but a set of much stricter permissions for a folder that's for all your production projects. And then decide how the roles are inherited by projects in the folder. So any user in a folder inherits the right set of permissions. The project creator role is important to think about. It's the person who's able to create projects and inherently allow resources to be spun up. Make sure the right people have that, and that the people who shouldn't have it don't have it. Because projects are another way that you can see costs spin up that you're not aware of, or your CTO spin up a project that you don't know the name of. Think about who the project owners and users should be. Usually this is pretty straightforward. But in particular, think about who project viewers should be, because there's ways to assign project cost viewing that's useful for people who just need to see what's going on in the project, but you don't want them to affect the operations of that project. So best practices, just in summary, create meaningful project names that help with identification. You can protect projects that are mission critical through the right policies, especially at the folder level for production folders. Plan and test your resource hierarchy, especially if you're moving projects between them. Because as you can imagine, if you can inherit permissions and policies from the folder, if you move a project from a less strict set of permissions to a more strict set of permissions under a new folder, things could break, and you want to test that before migrating. And then make sure the right set of people, the project owners, users, viewers, can see the cost that they should see to be able to own their cost trends and actually deliver good results for your organization. So I promised we were going to talk about billing account and organization configuration examples in the wild. So here they are. This will be a quick run through. The simplest example is what I like to call a simple organization. Now the actual simplest version of this would be without an organization, because when you start on Google Cloud Platform, you get a default project, and that's it. You start spinning up resources in that project. But the first organization you can build is just to add an organization to that project. And there's one billing account that pays for it. So everything's very simple. As your usage grows, you'll get more projects, and those projects can still be paid for by a billing account, and they're still under the same organization. You can start to take advantage of labels to distinguish between projects, and labels to distinguish between usage within a project and common usage across projects. Now, that's not a scalable strategy. So we have users who have hundreds or thousands of projects, and there's no person who wants to be hired to manage hundreds or thousands of a growing list of projects. That Excel spreadsheet breaks down, and a way to organize that in advance is to just put common projects into the same folder and create folders for that. So we see customers who take great advantage of this. They might have a production folder, a test folder. They might even have a sandbox folder where anyone in their organization can create projects with limited spending ability, just so that they don't need to actively manage what's in that folder, but they know where those projects end up. Now, the way that this example is different from the previous one is you might have noticed there's now a second billing account. Before, every project had the same billing account, but I mentioned, and Max mentioned this presentation, that there's some cases that require you to have a second billing account or more than one billing account. Here, a good example for Project 4 would be using resources that require to pay in a different currency, or having a business entity in another country with different tax treatment. So it requires a separate invoice and a separate billing account for that project. And finally, at the largest end of the spectrum, there are customers that are basically large multinational companies, large multinational organizations. We, Max, myself, other people might be talking to one person in the organization, thinking about how they're organizing resources across countries, across their .com domain, their .co.jp domain. But actually, for most purposes, they look like two separate customers because, in fact, they are different business entities. So they'll have different organizations and different billing accounts for those organizations.
And probably worth calling out here, it's not depicted, but these probably also have separate payment profiles, separate legal entities that are sort of behind those or connected to those billing accounts.
That's right. And so just as a mental model, it's useful to think of these as separate companies. We want to put all of the best practices on one slide, so you can come back after this webinar, come to this slide, and see everything we're recommending in one place. And we've consolidated some of these for readability. And before we wrap up, I just want to cover some common questions Max and I get. So the first one is something that support gets a lot.
Yeah, can I protect a project from accidental deletion? So this is something that actually you can do by placing what's called a lien on your project, which effectively locks a project down so that if someone goes to delete it, it will prevent that from happening until you remove the lien. Mm-hmm. So that's possible.
The second one, when should I use labels versus folders and projects to organize resources? This one, I'm going to give us an unsatisfying answer. It's kind of like what an economist would say, this really depends. But a useful way to think about it when you're making this decision is what each organization method's strengths and weaknesses are. Folders and projects are a hierarchical way of managing things, so that if you have a project and you create resources in the project will always report the cost of all the resources in it. Same for folders. The folders, you can always query the costs under a folder, regardless of new projects being added to it, new resources. On the other hand, labels are great for distinguishing between resources within a project, finding similar resource and usage across projects. But unlike the kind of discipline of having a hierarchy, labels need to be governed, labels need consistency, and they need processes that create that governance and consistency. So depending on your organization, the way you organize your work, your processes, one may be better than the other. Some customers use projects to manage environments. Other customers use labels. It is something that depends on how you do business. And then finally, how do I do chargeback or showback of my costs? In the first webinar, I did a demo of billing reports and some other tools, billing export, and we'll do a more thorough deep dive in the next webinar. But the first place to think about this are who are the people that should be seeing costs. So we talked through all the different entities that you should think about: payment profile, billing account, project, resources. Make sure the right people have the right access to view the cost on each resource, and then start to create the culture of showback. One final note on this is that we don't generate separate invoices for the same billing account, so the way to really do good chargeback is to make sure you have good resource organization.
That's right.
And finally, here's a set of next steps and resources you can look at. The first one's a great one, and is the reason I've invited Max to speak with me today.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the start, didn't get to go through all of the various configuration steps in detail, but luckily we do have a guide for you to follow that'll take you step by step through all of the decisions that you need to make and cover all of the various resources we discussed today. So really strongly encourage you to go through this, whether you're configuring GCP for the first time, or if you've already done that, you've already been using it, to go back and sort of walk through that as kind of a gut check to make sure you've set things up in the right way.
Yep, there's also this webinar series. So the next one will be on monitoring and forecasting. And then we have Google Next in April, so we'll be skipping the April webinar because there's going to be a lot of good content that comes out of Google Next, and then resume after Google Next. And then the three other resources here are worth taking a look at. One is general cost and financial governance on Google Cloud. There's the documentation, which you should take a look at. It has in particular great examples for how to do specific BigQuery queries on your export, set up Data Studio, and things like that. And then the release notes, so you know what's new, what we've been releasing recently, and can keep up to date with changes. All right, thank you for tuning in. Please visit Cloud OnAir for more content from our Google Cloud experts, and that's a wrap.